must possess a set of inherent attributes, which include equity, which encompasses assets and liability. Assets consist of real rights and credit rights, also known as personal rights, while liabilities include obligations. Credit rights represent economic benefit or abstentions that the creditor can demand from a debtor, whereas obligations establish the legal duty of a debtor to fulfill these demands. An obligation is a legal relationship in which one party, the creditor, has the right to enforce the other party, which is the debtor, to provide something of value or perform a specific action. This enforceable demand can involve giving, doing, or refraining from an action. For example, in a sales contract, the seller is obligated to transfer ownership of an item or right, and the buyer is obligated to pay the agreed price. Obligations in legal context consist of three fundamental elements. First, there's the subject, which refers to the parties that are involved: the creditor, who has the right to enforce the obligation, and the debtor, who is obligated to perform. Then we have the object of the obligation, which must meet a specific criteria that should be licit, meaning it must not violate any laws or regulations, that it could be possible, indicated it must be feasible to fulfill and determine, which clearly specifies what they need to be done or provided. Lastly, obligations are underpinned by legal relationship, establish a framework in which the creditor can demand the fulfillment of the debt. Talking about the object of the obligation, as we said before, first it has to be licit. That means complying with legal standards. It must be possible to fulfill. It means that it must meet the capabilities of the debtor to be performed, and it must be determined. It must be clearly defined and identifiable to avoid ambiguities. This requirement ensures clarity and enforceability in legal obligations, whether they involve the transfer of property, the provision of services, or other forms of contractual duty. The source of obligations are those legal events that create a relationship between the creditor and the debtor. These events are specified by law. The primary source of obligation is a contract, where the parties voluntarily agree to terms that obligate them to perform certain actions or provide services or any other action. Contracts outline the rights and responsibilities for each party, ensuring legal enforcement of their mutual obligations. The effects of obligation is the legal consequences that arise from the relationship between the debtor and the creditor. When obligations are established, they create enforceable rights and duty for those parties. This means that the creditor has the legal right to demand that the debtor fulfill the obligations, whether it involves delivering goods, performing services, or making payments. Failure to meet this obligation can lead to legal remedies such as damages or specific performance, depending on the term upon the contract has been signed. There are several types of obligation prescribed by our civil code, but the first three main obligations are obligations to give, which means that the involvement of transferring ownership of a specific object or providing something tangible. For example, a person sells their car to someone. The seller is legally obligated to transfer the ownership of the car to the buyer. Within obligations to do, an obligation to do requires the debtor to perform a specific action or service. For example, a landscaping company hired to mow the lawn of a residential property every week. The company is legally obligated to perform specific action, which is mowing the lawn, as agreed upon the contract with the homeowner. At last, in these three, we have obligations to refrain. Obligaciones de no hacer. This forbids the debtor from engaging in a particular action. For example, if you hire like an Uber, you can't smoke in the Uber car. Or in the case of an employment agreement, the confidential agreement between the employee and the employer, in which the employee is obligated not to disclose confidential company information to third parties. There are also other types of obligations in which their performance deals with something, a conditional term or a specific action from one of, or either the creditor or the debtor. The first one are called conditional obligations. Conditional obligations, in legal terms, depends on the future and on certain events that decide whether an obligation will be fulfilled or canceled. These events, called conditions, determine the outcome of the obligation. We have two: suspensive condition, which delays the fulfillment of the obligation until a future event that we don't know if it's going to happen or not occurs. For instance, if someone books a tour with the condition that enough people sign up, the tour will only proceed once the required number of participants is met. If the number is not met, well, the tour will be canceled. That's one condition. Then we have resolutory conditions, which terminate the obligations once specified events happens. For example, a hotel may reserve a room depending on the payment by certain date. If the payment isn't received at that date, the hotel is no longer obligated to hold the reservation, and the room may be given to someone else. Then we have obligations subject to term. Those are where the enforceability of the obligation is postponed or extinguished based on the fulfillment of a specific period or condition. Suspensive term means that the obligation becomes enforceable only after a specific condition is met. For example, a travel agency may have to pay a tour guide at the end of each month after conducting tours. The obligation to pay arises only when the tours are complete. Resolutory terms, in this case, the existing obligation ends once the condition is fulfilled. In a car lease, we must state the monthly payment stop if the lease is faced to pay on time. This means that if the lessee misses the payment deadline, the obligation to continue paying monthly ceases. Then we have certain and uncertain terms. Certain terms specify a clear date or event that determines when the obligation must be fulfilled. If you have a subscription to require payments to be on the first of every month, the obligation to pay rises exact on that day, while in uncertain terms depending on an event that may or not may happen. A bonus payment for employees depends on the company's meeting its annual revenue plan. That's an example. Then we have alternative and joint obligation. A joint obligation is when the debtor must fill all specified performance conditions. For example, in a tourist company may have the obligation to organize a vacation package, which includes transportation, accommodation, and tourist activities. The failure to deliver any of these constitutes a total breach of the joint obligation. You have to fulfill everything. While alternative obligation, only the debtor has several options to fulfill the obligation, and only one of them needs to be fulfilled. If a tourist might have the option to choose between a different excursion to include in their vacation packages, when one of them which are satisfied, then the obligation is fulfilled.